My name is Jerry Biederman, and I'm the chair of the Administrative Council of the Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights. JBI is now in its 45th year and works to strengthen international human rights institutions and non-governmental advocacy in order to protect human rights on a worldwide basis. And I'm very pleased in that capacity to welcome all of you to today's important event. We're honored to have as our speaker the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, who's going to speak on the state of human rights in the world. He has quite an impressive biography, but it's in your materials, so I will leave you to read it on your own. This marks the third lecture in JBI Human Rights series, which has been very generously funded by Bob Rifkind. During his time as chair of the JBI Administrative Council, Bob encouraged JBI to condemn the genocidal conflicts in Bosnia and in Rwanda, and to encourage the development of international criminal justice, including the central role of Raphael Lemkin in his development of that field. We're grateful to Bob for continuing to serve on the JBI Steering Committee and for consistently urging JBI to ensure that international human rights mechanisms have a concrete positive impact on the most pressing human rights crises of our time. So thank you very much, Bob. We appreciate it. And we're very pleased to welcome so many members of the JBI Administrative Council who are with us today. I'd like to thank the JBI staff for organizing this wonderful event. And now I'm delighted to introduce Felice Gaer, the director of JBI, who will introduce our guest lecturer. In addition to leading JBI, Felice is a former commissioner and chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She's been nominated and elected to 5 terms on the Committee Against Torture, a UN Human Rights Treaty monitoring body, and currently serves as its vice chair. And I will just add, she's also a force of nature. So, please come to the podium. And
thank you, Jerry, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a special occasion when we have one of these lectures, and I'm really glad you could all be with us. A little bit of history. At the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945, Jacob Blaustein, who was an industrialist by profession and a very practical man, was also chair of the American Jewish Committee at the time, played a critical role in ensuring that human rights would be included in the Charter of the United Nations. He had the view that only if the rights of every person was protected could the rights of particular ethnic and religious minorities, including Jews who had suffered so during the Holocaust, also be ensured and future conflicts be avoided. AJC had actually commissioned an International Bill of Human Rights by Hirsch Lauderpacht, the definitive study, which provided the concept for the Universal Declaration and the covenants. Jacob Blaustein and Joseph Proskauer were NGO consultants to the UN delegation in the drafting conference in 1945. And as the history books show, they were decisive in ensuring government support for the inclusion of human rights provisions in the UN Charter, including as one of the purposes of the world body. Jacob Blaustein continued to push for the creation of mechanisms to ensure human rights mentioned in the Charter would be proclaimed in a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course that those rights would be implemented in practice. In 1963, Blaustein delivered a memorial lecture regarding his friend, Dag Hammarskjöld, who had tragically died. And in that lecture, he proposed the appointment by the Secretary General of the United Nations of a United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights was created to honor the work and vision of Jacob Blaustein, and it is committed to strengthening the human rights mechanisms of the United Nations and other international organizations. A key focus of JBI was the establishment of the post of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The JBI was particularly instrumental in coalescing NGO advocacy around the creation of the High Commissioner post in the months prior to the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, and in gaining the support then of the Clinton administration and other governments for the idea during the preparatory conferences. At the Vienna conference, about 40 states explicitly championed the concept of a High Commissioner, and the World Conference in June 1993 recommended the General Assembly consider the establishment of the post as a matter of high priority. Well, that post was created by the General Assembly in December of 1993, so right away. The General Assembly resolution establishing the post said that this High Commissioner would be, and I quote, the UN official with principal authority for UN human rights activities. And this High Commissioner would, quote, play an active role in removing the obstacles to full realization of all human rights. And this official would also function under the direction and authority of the Secretary General. And this official would carry out tasks assigned by the competent bodies of the United Nations system and make recommendations to them. Now, as you can appreciate, this is a tall order. And the question before us over these years has been whether the High Commissioner for Human Rights can fulfill the promise that we and others saw in this post. Can the High Commissioner truly serve as conscience for the world? Can the High Commissioner be a conscience and a champion and a critic and a consensus builder and an administrator and manager all at once? Can the High Commissioner function with independence and integrity in the politicized and often toxic world of the United Nations? Well, we at the Jacob Blaustein Institute have been monitoring this, offering our advice and our criticism about the role of the High Commissioner. And we are very pleased today to hear from Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, the 6th United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Zeid has been intrepid in speaking out on the issues of the day. I'll give you just one example, because you've come to hear him, not me. In September 2016, he addressed a number of political leaders in The Hague, warning about populists, demagogues, and what he termed political fantasists. To them, he said, quote, I must be a sort of nightmare. I am the global voice of human rights and the critic of almost all governments. And he concluded by warning them as follows, quote, we will not be bullied by you, the bully, nor fooled by you, the deceiver. Not again, no more, because we, not you, will steer our collective fate. How honored I am to introduce you to High Commissioner Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. Thank you.
Thank you, Felice, Jerry, Bob, for organizing this event and lecture, and for the lovely welcome, a far remove from the cutting and cold comment made to me as I was having breakfast this morning. And 14-year-old daughters have a special skill by which they pierce the egos of their fathers. It was done so casually. The brutality of it came from its simplicity, its sort of elegance. my daughter walked into our kitchen nonchalantly, and without even looking at me, she uttered, "So how long do you have to go as a grey UN bureaucrat?" By comparison, I feel loved here and welcome. Dear colleagues, dear friends, what's happening to us when human rights have to be defended everywhere increasingly, when our outrage finds no pause and our concerns over violations only heighten instead of ebbing, even in countries that are prosperous and stable? How is it that a child can so easily understand the critical need to uphold human rights, the idea of fairness, and yet their significance seems to defeat so many governments? More and more leaders no longer even pretend to care about rights, seduced as they are by the masculine posturing of power relationships. Realism is what it used to be called. Now the US administration refers to it as principled realism, to pitch it as something other than rapacious or capricious. Forgive me for asking, but why is it not obvious to the champions of this approach that even when shunned in their worldview, human rights, nevertheless, in reality, remain stubbornly center stage? Human experience is simply unyielding on this point. When a state becomes hollow of principle, for example, defaults on its human rights obligations to its own people, or even in the way it treats others elsewhere, does it not provoke those who sense the injustice? Is it not the case those who feel wronged will usually choose to express their discontent democratically, or if the state is authoritarian, at least in non-violent forms of dissent? If their pleadings are then ignored or dismissed over years or decades by the state authorities, or even worse, crushed violently and brutally by them, is it not plausible the opposition could then harden, even become militant? If a panicking government which is persuaded force is the only solution, then feverishly begins stripping the wider population of its rights as it goes about annihilating what it sees as a threat, what then? The winners would be the recruiters of the militants, or for the militants. Helped from other quarters, terrorism could then burst forth with acts that horrify all of us. And a shaken government sinks itself into ever greater spasms of violence in response. And by that stage, the state is racked by insecurity. People flee, and huge numbers suffer grievously. Multiply many times over, and regrettably, this is the ascending portrait of much of our world today. The Jacob Blaustein Institute has been a tireless friend of human rights and to my office, and may I take this occasion to pay a special tribute to Felice Gaer, who has been an exceptional friend to me personally and to my office for many years, as well as a highly regarded champion of the universal human rights agenda in her own right, and particularly when it comes to the prohibition of torture. You can clap. And because of these many years of support and helpful reflection by the Jacob Blaustein Institute, I want to examine with you today the fallacy, the growing belief which holds that somehow human rights are inconsistent with the world of today, a world which demands us to be, or demands of us, a steelier, more Machiavellian orientation. It is a worldview which contrasts the excitement of political combat, the thrill of military action, with the tediousness of principle, of law, of human rights, a view that some who have turned away from the lessons of history are inclined to embrace. The kaleidoscope of global power is also changing. Most evidently, the rise of China economically and in terms of the consolidation of power within the country and its strategic ambitions. There is also the assertiveness of Russia, the unhasty but steady wielding of its power and influence. And yet this confidence on the part of both countries is at odds with their seeming fear of independent civil society, human rights defenders, and the universal human rights agenda finding anchor within their countries and then growing. How the two will relate to each other in the future is anyone's guess. Then there is the tumult the US finds itself in now, caught somewhere between isolationism and militarism, with no clear direction in foreign policy apart from a few notable exceptional files. The European Union faces multiple quandaries too: Brexit, Poland, Hungary, and now a 31-year-old Austrian leader whose populist-leaning views on migration may well pose further challenges. In this landscape, I must also factor in the rise of the major IT firms investing heavily in artificial intelligence and machine learning, some becoming more powerful than many states, but still subject to the enormous forces generated by the major powers as they elbow each other for global influence and as they wage a half-voiced, low-level cyber warfare against each other, while also producing deadlock in the world's major multilateral fora. Fora crafted for the sake of ultimately settling emerging crises, but which now, for the most part, only pass comment on them. A few years ago, before I assumed my current position, I witnessed this paralysis firsthand in the short months I served in the UN Security Council, and I'm very pleased to see Ambassador Rosemary DiCarlo. Where are you, Rosemary? But Rosemary was with me, and we suffered together, I think. Chairing two sanctions committees in relation to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Liberia, it was hard for my team to accomplish much when the US and the Russian Federation gummed up much of the work through reciprocal blocking actions, which stemmed from the deep divide between them created by the Syrian conflict. And this was felt throughout much of the agenda of the Security Council at the time. It has only become worse since then, reducing a once powerful global body to what is now a faint likeness of what it was intended to be. My subsequent appointment as High Commissioner also coincided with the horrors of Daesh as its crimes were being posted online. For almost 40 years, Takfiri-driven terrorism, together with its Shia counterpart in the Middle East, has stalked parts of the planet and proven itself utterly resistant to security-only approaches. It has been forced back at times, yes, but then rebounded quickly, feeding off the resentment that blindly oppressive force always creates. Yet governments have continued to abide by the same failed strategies. The most glaring of all mistakes in fighting terrorism is the sidelining of human rights concerns, and worse still, the willful destruction of civil society using terrorism as a pretext. Ultimately, these measures serve the cause of terrorists, and yet governments persist in this stupidity. The negative consequences of denying space to human rights considerations are brutally obvious to me and to you, but it appears many leaders view human rights as an esoteric stream of international law promoted mainly by Western idealists, leftists, liberals, or hypocrites with little applicability to the big issues. This view is not monopolized by authoritarian leaders only. others in well-established democracies are straying into this form of thinking. I devoted a lecture to this topic in London a few months ago after Prime Minister Theresa May said publicly that human rights laws would be overturned if they get in the way of fighting terrorists. It was shorthand for saying human rights law was inconsistent with the real world. Does this reflect the failure of the human rights movement to demonstrate the relevance and enormous practical value of measures to uphold human rights? The system itself, treaty bodies, the Human Rights Council and its special procedures, my own office to some extent, we have perhaps failed to stimulate very broad public interest. The human rights machinery will often appear to the layperson as too rigid, too loyally, almost undecipherable or indecipherable, like the terms on a banking document recognized as important, but not written to be read, much less understood by an ordinary person. And to the national leader in the day-to-day struggles, human rights probably come across as nagging constraints. The same could be said of many diplomats with whom we work, and even inside the UN, there is an underappreciation of human rights in some quarters. The current press attention on the UN's handling of the Rohingya file in Myanmar alleges not all UN officials in recent years understood the consequences of downplaying the violations of human rights suffered by the Rohingya community. But time and again, the denial of human rights considerations by national leaders, diplomats, and international actors alike has, in the longer term, proven itself to be absolutely disastrous in terms of preventing terrorism, conflict, and violence, and yet it still happens. To compound our difficulties, the multilateral framework itself is now being accused of being a threat to states or portrayed as the object of manipulation by states. In his address to the General Assembly on the 19th of September, President Trump attacked unnamed authoritarian powers for seeking, and I quote, to collapse the values and systems put in place since the end of the Second World War. He exhorted the assembled delegations to, and I quote again, put your countries first, end quote, and made constant references to sovereignty. But he also introduced something else, a variation of Marine Le Pen's argument that global organizations and institutions have become in themselves a danger to the diversity of cultures and sovereign decision-making on the part of states. Speaking of faraway bureaucrats, President Trump implied that at the very least, these institutions had become a medium exploited by some governments at the expense of others. In other words, coming from the US President's perspective, the global organizations, and I presume their international legal frameworks, including universal human rights, were now becoming part of a problem and not the solution. There could be no substitute, he concluded, for patriotism, coalition building, and ultimately confrontation if so required. That was the president's realism, accented by principles or values which he did not go on to define. His constant invoking of patriotism led many in the audience to conclude the term was a euphemism for nationalism, chauvinistic nationalism. When I heard the speech, my immediate reaction, like so many others, was, well, we have been there before. This very cocktail was consumed in the last century. One part chauvinistic nationalisms, one part balance of power swordplay and a crumbling adherence to law. Add in the belief threats of violence and ultimatums will be effective. swirl in the presence of terrorism, creating combustible fears which can be manipulated, and then stampede the public into policies from which there is no way out. The combination of all of this in the early part of the 20th century led to the annihilation of millions of people. The calamity of 2 world wars and the Holocaust was precisely what led humanity to create, in the first place, our global security architecture, our global financial and human rights architectures. And now they were being questioned by the leader of the very country that shouldered the lion's share of building and maintaining those very institutions. I then asked myself, if the President of the United States was seemingly triggering a gradual US abandonment of the international legal order, was it because we who work for the United Nations and its human rights mechanisms have failed catastrophically to make our case? What seems evident to us in the human rights community may seem less so to others. My own thinking on this is best encapsulated by the wording of paragraph 1 of the Preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as it was in the Cassin draft, the second draft. The version I always preferred because of its starkness, before it was repackaged into more polished diplomatic language and placed in the second paragraph of the eventual text. In its earlier, sharper version, the text begins, and I quote, "that ignorance and contempt of human rights have been among the principal causes of the sufferings of humanity," end quote. Now, ignorance was never going to be a problem for the generations who experienced the global catastrophes of the 20th century, because they knew firsthand what the alternative would bring. But it could be a problem once those generations began to take their leave of us. And the obvious challenge is this: can historical memory alone sustain the international legal order, even if it had been consecrated in law, principally treaty law? Tragically, the increasing human rights violations around the world and the growing flirtation with realism would seem to answer the question for us and explain the contempt for human rights more generally, stemming, as it does, from corresponding ignorance. How do we change this? How do we make those who believe in realism grasp the extent to which any tactical advantage gained from abandoning the legal framework and human rights will matter little when all is ultimately destroyed? How do we convince them? The antidote must surely lie in first building a campaign devoted to rapidly expanding the knowledge about human rights and then putting the argument across to the skeptics. It will mean weaving together a large number of states, those who still believe in the importance of a rights framework, to help us better promote the system. Many will not volunteer so easily. Antagonizing some of the major powers is not a joyful experience, unless of course they feel compelled to do so by their own vulnerabilities and by their own people. What is missing, therefore, and what would change the trajectory would be the existence of a much broader, indeed worldwide, wave of popular support for universal human rights, pushing, prodding, holding their governments to the mark, and shaking up the slumbering politicians. We must now intensify greatly our advocacy and expand our reach in a manner that is without precedent. No longer should we be satisfied that sessions of the Human Rights Council achieve a few thousand views online, or that press releases from special rapporteurs or commissions of inquiry generate a few thousand press articles, or that my office has almost 2 million followers on our Twitter feed. Not in a world of 7.6 billion people. We need now to connect to tens of millions of people, and quickly. In a few weeks, we will begin a year-long celebration of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this mighty set of commitments that discredits tyranny, the discrimination and contempt for human beings which have scarred human history. We must use this commemoration to alert and crucially to inform, to explain clearly to people the world over that human rights law is not some idle luxury, weird or out of touch with the realities of today. Rather, it is one of the most delicate and critical inventions contrived by humans for the upholding of global peace. Because we are now in a world being thrown off balance by lies and deceit, so we need the certainty and security of its universal laws. We need the anchor of principles steeped in the lessons of human experience. Ultimately, this is not only about people's intrinsic rights, it could well be about their lives. Those who once believed technology and globalization would save humanity have been proven wrong in the past, and dramatically so. In 1913, the president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, famously said, and I quote, "The Great War, that eternal threat, will never come. The bankers won't come up with the money needed for such a war, and industry won't support it, and so the statesmen simply won't be able to do it. There will be no great war," end quote. The president failed to factor in the toxicity of delusion. Jacob Blaustein spoke to this point many years later. In April 1950, he spoke to the American Jewish Committee about, and I quote, "the spirit of belligerent fanaticism. Once it was let loose," he warned, "it overwhelms," and I quote, "the voice of reason," end quote. But even today, as we seem to be edging back to those calamitous policies, that lure of belligerent fanaticism, the struggle which has fallen to our generation is not hopeless. Yes, chauvinistic nationalism is dangerous, and the politics of scapegoating, which cultivates fear, shapes it into blame, and then harvests it as roaring crowds blindly lash out at the vulnerable, are a potent and damaging force. But so too were other historic challenges confronted successfully by advocates of what is right and just. Our predecessors, the giants of the rights movement, ended slavery, colonialism, segregation, apartheid, and more. Now it is up to us. It is up to me. It's up to you in this room, to every kind of audience we can reach, in every country where there is still space to express thoughts, to participate in decisions, and raise one's voice. We need to stand up for the human rights system and act to promote peace. We need to fight back against discrimination and uphold justice, even at this most difficult time. It may well be thankless and dangerous work at times, especially for the human rights defenders in authoritarian countries who are at the sharp end of the wedge. But I have always found solace in Dag Hammarskjöld's reflection in this respect, and he said, and I quote, "To build for man a world without fear, we must be without fear," end quote. To answer my own question posed at the start of this lecture, what is happening to us? The answer is straightforward. We are beginning to organize, to stir and mobilize in defense of human decency, in defense of a common future, and in defense of human rights, which, returning to Jacob Blaustein, is the very voice of human reason itself. I thank you for your kind attention.